So really, this week's share is about davening, about tefillah. So this will hopefully help us, because we all have to be davening more and davening better, right? In Eis Tzara, and it starts with a Rashi that disturbs many people. I think should disturb many people. So if you haven't been disturbed, I'll try to help you get disturbed. Right? We have Yitzchak and Rivka davening for children. Vayetar Yitzchak laHashem lenochach ishto. Right? Rashi sets it up of Yitzchak and Rivka being each one in their own corner. Ki akarahi, because she was not able to have children. Vaye'aser lo Hashem, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered him, Yitzchak, Vatar Rivka ishto, and Rivka became pregnant. Says Rashi. It says, Vaye'aser lo, right, that Hashem answered him, meaning Yitzchak, and he brings from the Gemara in Yevamos, the diuk, it said, lo v'lo lo, him but not her. She'ein dom tfilas tzadik ben Rasha, l'tfilas tzadik ben tzadik. Because you can't compare, who was her father was Lavan, who was Yitzchak's father, Avram Avinu. Okay? And then Rashi repeats even the fikach, lo v'lo lo. Therefore him and not her. So the reason this is so disturbing, first of all, the most simple thing. We believe that every tefillah does something. Ein tefillah shechazer zreikom. So it's a simple equation. Yitzchak daven for child. Rivka daven for child. Baruch Hashem, she became pregnant. So we would say Hashem answered their tefillahs. Right? Why do we have to assume someone not answering her tefillah? Why in the world would that be? Number one. Number two is, what does that mean? That a person's value in life is locked in by who their father was? Right? That's it? With all due, you did great, Rivka, really great, really fabulous, but when it comes down to it, you got to realize there's people with yichus and there's people without, right? You got to know your place, right? When it comes up there to Shamayim, some with yichus, that's going to go. How could that be? How could that possibly be? Right? And what about the Maila of a Tzaddik ben Rasha, what Rivka had to go through to be who she was in such a house of Besul and Lavan?
Yeah, it's a little worse because Rashi, the next Rashi, or maybe one shortly after that, says B'Shevach.
Correct.
She was able to overcome the people and the place.
Right. It was a bad place. It was bad people. And you see when it talks there that when Eliezer came, Besula v'ish lo yada, Rashi says what the other young women were doing there in that area, and she was able to resist all of it. So why shouldn't that be, right? This tremendous power. It doesn't make sense to us, and it hurts people. This idea that somehow there are some people from a privileged caste, and other people who aren't, that they're the chashiva families, they're this, they're that. People with lineage, this doesn't seem to be us. That shouldn't be who we are. There's a story I liked about a man. He was not very wealthy, and he went to his Rebbe and he asked for it. And his Rebbe told him you should really give tzedakah, right, in a way which is orderly. Really give all the tzedakah you should. And he gave to assorted poor people, and he started becoming wealthy. As he started becoming wealthy, he started to think to himself, okay, look, as a businessman, I check into the investments I make, and I try to invest in grade A investments. So, tzedakah, with all due respect, these guys I'm giving to, a lot of them are poor, but they're really like schnooks. I could invest in top poor Talmidei Chachamim and Tzaddikim. That's the ultimate investment. So he started getting very picky and giving to these particularly these Tzaddikim and Talmidei Chachamim. And his business started going down. So he came to his Rebbe, he said, why should this be? I'm really upping the game in my tzedakah. He says, look, here's what was happening. Before, you gave tzedakah to all sorts of people, even if they weren't so worthy. So Hashem gave to you, even though you're not so worthy, right? But now you're saying, no, only the best should get. Guess what? You don't get either. Okay, so again, this idea of being picky, does that mean a person says, well, my wife's going to be davening by the Shabbos candle, so I want to marry someone whose father's a tzaddik, because otherwise my wife's father's not a tzaddik, it's not going to go through. What does that mean? Okay, what could it mean? So there are many approaches to this in different svarim. I'm going to share a few. Really, you can come at it from different directions. That helps. So the first one is from the Sefer Tzemach Hashem L'Tzvi. This was one of the Nadvorna Rebbes, Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvorna. Nadvorna was a dynasty that goes on to this day. What's fascinating about it is there are a lot of Nadvorna Rebbes, right? You'll find in different towns, and some of them, you know, even if they don't have the name Nadvorna in it, like the Pittsburgher Rebbe, who was now in Ashdod, but was in Pittsburgh, the Clevelander, they're all Nadvornas. And the story they tell is that towards the 1900s, one Nadvorna Rebbe said, this is what I want from all my male descendants, they should be Rebbes. And somebody asked him, why do you want them all to be Rebbes? He said, that way they'll probably be Shomer Shabbos. He said that was his formula. You know, if the guy's a Rebbe, at least they will be Shomer Shabbos. So he says like this. He has a fabulous diuk. It's delicious. He says, I heard in the name of Gaon Echad, Shaperush Kach. He says, you have to approach this by noticing something that doesn't fit in Rashi's Lashon. It says, Eino dome tfilas tzadik ben tzadik litfilas tzadik ben Rasha. You can't compare the tefillah of a tzadik ben tzadik to that of a tzadik ben Rasha. Usually when you're saying a phrase like that, the first thing you mention is a thing that's not so great, and the second thing is that which is really great. Like if I say you can't compare a frozen microwave dinner to a nice home-cooked meal. I don't say you can't compare a nice home-cooked meal to a frozen dinner. That would imply that the frozen dinner is somehow better. So he says here, Rashi's saying, Eino doma tfilas tzadik ben tzadik. You can't compare the tfilas tzadik ben tzadik to the tefillah of tzadik ben Rasha, implying tfilas tzadik ben Rasha is better. It's a beautiful diuk. Okay, so he says like this. He says, and in fact, that's true. He sends us to the Gemara in Tainus, which tells the story of how Rabbi Eliezer, right, a few stories there about Rabbi Eliezer and rain, and one of them is that Rabbi Eliezer davened, he was the Shliach Tzibur, he said the 24 brachos that you say when there is a big drought, v'lo nena, and he wasn't answered. Yorad Rabbi Akiva Acharov, Rabbi Akiva went down afterwards, v'amar, Avinu Malkeinu, in lanu melech el ata. Avinu Malkeinu, lemancha rachem aleinu, boom. The clouds opened and it came. And they said, in the Gemara, a bas kol came out and said, right, because they were starting to think, does that mean Rabbi Eliezer is not as good as Rabbi Akiva? They said, it's not that one is greater than the other. Ela shezeh mavir al midosov, v'zeh eino mavir al midosov. So the Chachmas Manoach explains, what does it mean, mavir al midosov? Rabbi Akiva grew up in a rough background, and therefore he really had a struggle and fight to separate himself from negative habits and to do things, whereas Rabbi Eliezer, more naturally, just from where he grew up and what his nature was, didn't have to fight so much. So once again, he said that Gemara shows us that tefillah of the Tzadik ben Rasha is greater and should be greater. So therefore, what does it mean in the Gemara in Yevamos when it says Hashem listened lo v'lo lo, to him and not to her? It says just emphasizing what the Chiddush was. It's saying the Torah wanted to tell us it listened to him. Of course it listened to her. She's a Tzadik ben Rasha. But it's saying that even him, the Tzadik ben Tzadik, his tefillah also counted. Turns it upside down on the head. Okay? That's an interesting approach. Another approach now, from the Yismach Yisrael of Alexander, also one of the Dezer Rebbes, said a similar approach. First of all, he has a diuk also in the Rashi. The Rashi repeats this idea of lo v'lo lo. Right? He brings it in the beginning. It says that Hashem listened to him, lo v'lo lo, she'ein tfilas, ein domet tfilas tzadik ben Rasha tfilas tzadik ben tzadik. And then Rashi says again, lefichach, lo v'lo lo. That's repetitive. That's wordy. He says, to him and not to her, because you can't compare the tefillah of a tzaddik. You want to see?
Now, did you just say that backwards?
Which one? The tzaddik ben?
Yeah.
That you can't compare the tefillah of a tzaddik ben Rasha to the tefillah of tzaddik ben tzaddik. Right? So, so that was right. That seems opposite than the way he dashed it. He said, his girsa was she'ein domeh tefillah tzaddik ben tzaddik to tefillah tzaddik ben Rasha. Interesting. Okay? That's a different girsa than the Rashi, which that was based on. Good, you got that. Okay, so, but why the repetition at the end? Lefikach lo v'lo lo. So he explains like this. He says that when it comes to davening, one of the key ingredients is the idea of anova, of humility, of modesty, of shiflus even. This sense of, it's so hard to get the words in English, shiflus, lowliness, right? Hachna'ah, right, is an idea of submission. Shval ruach, correct. Lowly of spirit. That is such a key in what davening is and what davening does. Right? The whole idea of standing before Hashem, right? Lihispalel, they say in Sfarim, lihispalel, it's a hitpael form of the word, the root palel, which means to judge. Meaning you kind of, you judge again what life is like, what reality is. You put yourself in your place standing before Hashem, and therefore that lowliness is there. Now, a tzaddik ben tzaddik, right? Now again, let us realize also that tzaddik ben tzaddik doesn't mean from ben from. Okay, none of us know if we're tzaddikim or rishoyim. What we call a from person can be a big Rasha. We don't know. The Rambam says nobody can know the cheshbon of who they are, where they're holding, because even if they really neurotically wrote down every mitzvah they did and every avera they did, and they count up and they see more mitzvahs than averas, but everything has a relative weight. How difficult was that mitzvah for you to do, or how easy? How difficult was it for you to resist that avera, or how easy? We don't know, okay? But here, Yitzchak and Rivka, the Torah tells us they're tzaddikim, that we do know. But, he says, a tzaddik ben tzaddik, he says, he feels everything's in the schus of my forefathers, right? He really feels like nothing. It's the opposite of what we would think, right? And there are people certainly that use it the wrong way. They keep blowing off about their yichus and their yichus, my zaydi was, and his zaydi was, and this was, and that was. There's a saying in Yiddish, they say that yichus is like a potato, 99% of it's under the ground. Okay, in other words, the question is, who are you? Reb Zalman Nechemi Goldberg he said people worry about marrying the daughter of a Talmud Chacham, the sister of a Talmud Chacham. Most important, he said they should want to marry the wife of a Talmud Chacham. Right? That's the thing you should focus on, that you can do something about. Okay, so he says here to Yitzchak, who was truly honest in seeing these things, he said, I was brought up by Avram and Sarah. Right? Everything I have is from them. What do you expect? He says, I was born in Kedusha, into this home of Kedusha. Everything I do, I'm really nothing. And somebody who knows about the world of Chassidus explained this to me once also. He said, in the world of Chassidus, oftentimes Rebbe is like on the wedding invitation will write the son of this, who's the son of that, who's the son of that, from the Baal Shem Tov, from this, from that. And it looks like kind of showing off what it is. He says it's exactly the opposite. He says, as each generation goes on, each Rebbe feels more nothing. Meaning, look where I'm coming from. Everything I have comes from this one to that one to that one to that one to that one. And I'm barely even, worthy to be their grandchild. And what do you expect if I get it from all this? Okay, so therefore, he said, I have nothing to say when I come to daven. It's interesting. It parallels, Rav Dessler brings down from the Alter of Slobodka. Right, a fascinating question. It says that Lot gets a reward. We're not supposed to start up war with his descendants, with Ammon and Moab. Why? Because when they went to Mitzrayim and Avraham Avinu was saying, passing Sarah off as his sister, Lot didn't blab and spill the beans and tell everybody that it's really his wife. So the Alter Slobodka asked, he said, wait a second, if we look at the life of Lot, that's what he should get a reward for? What about standing there in front of the door when he took his orchim in and the people of Sdom want to do who knows what to them, and he's standing there and saying no? Why not for that Mesiras Nefesh? So he answered, you got to realize, Lot grew up in the house of Avram Avinu. The Achnasas Orchim was in his blood, was in his bones, he said. And that came from Avram Avinu. That's not the ikar reward he receives in life. His reward was for a weakness he had. He liked to schmooze. He liked to let people know that he knew secrets. And he fought that, and that's considered his. Okay, so therefore it's true. You're the son of the Rebbe, the grandson of the Rebbe. You were brought up in the Rebbe's house, in the shtibel, with special melamdim. They dunked you in the mikveh from the time you were 1 day old or something. Okay, so he says, all right, so who am I? What am I? What did I do? Okay, he says, but Rivka really had no choice but to realize that everything she had, she did herself. Yes, with siyata dishmaya, but it certainly wasn't coming from Besul. Certainly wasn't coming from brother Lavan. It was all Rivka. And therefore, he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu listened to his tefillah because that extra level of anova was that which enabled the tefillah to penetrate and turn things around. That lashon of ve'osa, Rashi says, means like a pitchfork turns over a pile of hay. It turned everything around. But again, the question still is, beautiful, but why not say Hashem listened to both of their tefillahs? Let's say, okay, Yitzchak had the extra anova, but I'm sure Rivka's tefillah was pretty darn good tefillah. Why should it not be listened to? So this is the Yismach Yisrael of Alexander. He brings a fascinating explanation. Maisa Avos Simin Labonim. Okay, what the Avos did, all these stories we're reading are not just history, right? Not just little family chronicles of our ancestors. Everything there that's written in the Torah is there because it affects our lives to this day. It doesn't tell us what Avraham Avinu ate for breakfast. Why? Because we don't need to know. But if it tells us about these tefillahs and Hashem listening to Yitzchak and not to Rivka's, that's very important for us. Why? He says because when Yitzchak was davening, he wasn't just davening for his own childlessness. He was davening for all of Am Yisrael and including us and forging a path with his tefillah. And the tefillah that he forged was one that, even if a person has nothing, nonetheless, that he'll be able to be answered. Right? In the merit of his holy forefathers. That's what Yitzchak came for. He says, Rebbeinu Shalom, I'm nothing. Everything I have comes from Avram. I'm like an extension of Avram. Please answer me like that. So he says, therefore, when we come to daven, we say, you know the score. You know who I am. I'm nothing. So how do I dare to come and daven to you? Because that's the pathway Yitzchak opened. He opened that pathway of the one who is nothing, who says, everything I got came as a gift, and it came in the merit of my forefathers, and therefore I'm just asking. Whereas Rivka's tefillah, if we were to try and walk in the footsteps of Rivka's tefillah, we would have had to be like her. And then the gates would be closed on those of us who didn't have the schus that she had, who weren't like her. Okay, so therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who sees all the generations forward, and is Rachum V'chanun, right? He said he chose that tefillah of Yitzchak to be the one that would open there, because even though Yitzchak did have his own schus, but the way he approached the tefillah was, I got nothing on my own. So he says, therefore, we can daven like Yitzchak Avinu, b'schus avos, and we can also be saved, even if we're not worthy.
Where does it say in the Psukim that Yitzchak davened that way?
Oh, so he says, Tzadik ben Tzadik is exactly what that means. In other words, the picture of Tzadik ben Tzadik, why not just say Tzadik? He says what it means is, my tzidkas came from the Tzadik before me. That's the idea of Tzadik ben Tzadik. So that's a fascinating approach. Now I'll just share one more. I believe it was also from the Yismach Yisrael of Alexander. My svarim are a mess. There's a sefer about tefillah written by the Rav of Carmiel. His name's Rav Margalit. A very, very fascinating man. He's also an Alexander Chassid. And he brought another approach that's somewhat the opposite. Meaning, he says it's actually a bigger challenge to be a tzaddik ben tzaddik than a tzaddik ben rasha. Okay, this is taking the exact opposite approach. Why is it a bigger challenge? He says because a tzaddik ben tzaddik, when you grow up in the house of Avraham Avinu, it's so easy just to coast and ride on his coattails. Just to do that, not to do the avodah yourself, right? Just to cruise along. Avraham Avinu's going, and you're riding along with him, everything that's there. And that wouldn't be a tzaddik ben tzaddik. Tzaddik ben tzaddik means that he became a tzaddik in his own right. Even though he was the son of a tzaddik, but he forged his own path. It's almost like they say, there was the Rebbe they called the Yehudi HaKodesh of Pershischa, the holy Jew of Pershischa. So why did he get such a nickname? They said because his avodah was so intense that it was as if he became a ger tzedek every day. Every day it was like he was starting from fresh. He was doing it, he was making it fresh. It wasn't going by momentum, it wasn't going by inertia. Okay, Rivka did a tremendous thing, being a tzaddikus ben Rasha, but she didn't face that challenge of like falling asleep and just going through the motions. And that's a very big challenge, right? And every generation has to create its own tzidkus, so to speak, has to find itself and find its way of avodah that's appropriate to that generation. That has to be. They tell a funny mashal that the Shpola Zaydi used to tell. But it has a very important application. It says that the Yetzer Hara came to HaKadosh Baruch Hu one day, and he says, I'm bored. Right, like our kids say, I'm bored. He says, you created me, what am I supposed to do? So he says, look, there's somebody who was born, he's called Avraham Avinu. He's there, right, to make the world go big places. Your job is to stop him. Go. So the Yetzer Hara comes, he knocks on the door of Avram's tent. Before he can even open his mouth, Avram picks him up, gives him water for his feet, starts grilling, tongues for him and giving him things and water and washing, and you want to sleep in this, and then come, I'll be malavi you on your way. Next thing you know, he's outside the door and he's gone. So he messed up. After a while, he comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, I'm bored. He says, fine. Remember Avram that you failed with? He's got a son, Yitzchak. Go get him. So he prepares himself. Okay, if he starts doing the whole thing with the feeding and the drink and all this, I'm going to be ready for it. So he knocks on the door. Yitzchak Avinu opens up. He says, yes. He says, hi, I'm the Yetzer Hara. Meaning, well, I'd like to introduce you to some things you'd enjoy a lot, even though Hashem says you shouldn't do them. Yitzchak takes out a stick and he starts beating him. He says, Rasha, Yitzchak's midas hadin. Not the midas hachesed of Avraham. He ran off screaming. Again, he tries one last time. He says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what can I do? He says, the grandson's there, Yaakov. So try. So he prepares himself. Okay, if he's going to wine and dine me, I'm ready. If he's going to come at me with the baseball bat, I'm ready. He knocks on the door. Yaakov Avinu says, yes. He says, I'm the Yetzer Hara, and I would like you to do forbidden things that you can enjoy very much. And Yaakov says, why? What does that mean? Yaakov's midas ha'emes. It didn't speak to him at all. So the bottom line of that mashal, though, is that every generation has the Yetzer Hara they have to deal with, and they're the tools in Torah that they have to bring out. You have to be that tzaddik ben tzaddik. The approach of the tzaddik of the previous generation, even though we learned from it, and we learned from all of them, has to be the basis with which you bring out the tzaddik that can heal the wounds of the generation, that can do. And if not, if you're just trying to coast on what was, you're not going to deal with the Yetzer Hara of that generation. So this, I heard, Tolner Rebbe told us once that he heard this from his brother-in-law, Rabbi Weisblum Shlita, was the mashgiach of the yeshiva Nachlas Alavim in Haifa. And he was one of the closest Talmidim of Rav Wolbe. So he heard that toward the end of his life, he made a meeting of mashgichim from yeshivas in Yerushalayim. And he said, I keep getting reports that there are many yeshiva bachrim like draying around in the streets late at night, in places where they shouldn't be hanging out. So first, the people there started saying, Rebbe, there's always a few bad apples, there always has been, always will be. So he actually had someone film it. Right, and you show a picture of Kikar Tzion with all sorts of yeshiva guy-looking people wandering around in this. He said, don't tell me. It's a small thing. He says, the phenomenon is there. What should we do? So one mashgiach said, I think we should, across all the yeshivas, institute that there'll be a test Sunday morning on all the previous week's material, and any Talmud who doesn't get at least 80% will be thrown out of yeshiva. He says, what's that going to do? You'll just have more guys on the street. Another Mashgiach said, I think I know. He says, what helped me when I was in yeshiva was saying chaburas. Saying chaburas. You have a group of guys together, and every week somebody prepares a chabura, a whole lamdish shtickle to say over, and they ask him questions, and you do. He says it's so fulfilling, and it gives so much geschmack, and that really did it for me. Rav Wolbe said, I don't know if it would do it for them. So they said to him, so Rebbe, what? He says, I don't know. It's your job to find out. This is your generation. You have to find out what they're missing. You have to find out what their pain is. You have to find in the Torah that which speaks to them and that which is there. And that's that idea of tzaddik ben tzaddik. It's so easy to just do what was done because you've seen it. It's so hard to figure out. Rav Hirsch wrote a letter to a cousin. I used to have it. I got to find it again. And he wrote to this cousin. He wrote to her. He said, I know what my tafkid is. It was revealed to me what my task is in the world. He said it was with a dream. He said, I was once riding on a train in Germany and I fell asleep. In my dream, I felt that I was like floating above a small German village looking down. And what I saw in the village there were many old men like walking bent over with sticks. And the young people were grabbing the sticks away from them and cutting them up and making them into toys. And then I felt myself in the dream on the street in the village. And one of the old men walked over to me and he held out his stick. And the stick was battered and dirty and dusty. And he said, do you know what this is? I said, no. And he opened it up and it was a Sefer Torah. And with that I woke up. So he said, that made my mission clear, meaning that was what was happening in Germany. That the Torah as it was and as it was being transmitted to the young people looked dusty and dead and old. The Reform movement was taking the Torah and cutting it up and turning it into toys. He said, my task would be to give the authentic Torah, but in the way that would speak to them. And that was what he did. That was what he devoted himself to. So that's another mode that we have to do, and that really could help our tefillah, because everyone's tefillah has to be also for their generation, right? That's what's there. They say Noach was held accountable somewhat for not davening for his generation. And to daven is one thing, and certainly something we can do, but you have to go along with it with your ishtadlus also, to try and help the tzaddikim who are developing their paths, who are there to help them get out and reach the people that are there. Sometimes people say, what do we need another yeshiva for? You have to open another shul. You have to open something. But sometimes what was doesn't reach other people at other times. Doesn't mean you have to throw out the old, chas v'shalom, right? Because everything that's not built on the old isn't really legitimate, right? It has to be built on it and it's there, but it has to be something that's built from the bottom up in a way that's real. That's that aspect of tzaddik ben tzaddik. So we stand on the shoulders of giants, but we still got to do something up there. We can't just ride. That's what we have. Okay, may Hashem answer our tefillahs and bring Yeshuas to all.